Hey, y'all, Zach McDonald, your real estate agent with Real Property Associates, and this is my Seattle housing market watch for January 28th, 2025. Well, I forgot my computer this week, so we're doing this with a little less technology. Thankfully, there's a computer right here and some note-taking ability. So remarkable for the win. It's a great product, by the way. They didn't pay me to say this, but I have enjoyed my remarkable tablet. I see that they have a color one now. I've got the black and white version. It's been great. And something we're going to talk about here today is the potential impact of the California wildfires on the Seattle housing market. We'll talk about that towards the end of the video. But before we get there, we'll go through our normal rhythm here and just talk about inventory coming on the market, coming off the market in King and Snohomish County, two of the largest counties in Washington and the two that primarily make up the Seattle metro area. Now, as we're looking at new listings this past week, we had 453 single-family listings come on the market, which is an uptick from the 404 the previous week. We've been slowly seeing the housing inventory increasing, or at least the new listing inventory. But with a few different new clients, there are hardly any houses that meet their criteria right now. And that is common, right? There are, if you look at a map, it looks like there's all these listings, but when you start to dial it in, there aren't very many for the different segments of the population, people looking in the luxury market or even the, first-time home buyer market. Each one has houses, right? There's condos, but everything is pretty tight as far as the amount of houses on the market. And I suspect that will be the case here for the next few months. We'll start to see more houses coming on the market in February, and March is when it starts to really pick up every single year here in the Seattle area. Now, something interesting, right? As we're seeing these new listings coming on, we're also seeing quite a few price reductions still. So we had 147 price reductions, 188 last week. And what this says is that we still have houses that have been sitting on the market for a little while, right? And these houses, although not new listings, are opportunities for buyers to get a house for a better price or potentially be negotiating those prices a little bit, right? So not everything is selling over asking price still in this market, although some of the new listings are, right, if they're priced correctly. And sometimes houses do have things that are undesirable and there's no way around it, right? And those houses do tend to sit for longer and sell for less, sometimes starting out trying to get the same price as the other listings in the neighborhood and then starting to realize that's not going to happen based on the buyer activity. Now, when we look at pending sales were identical. So 625 last week, 625 this week. So the buyer activity is remaining stable. And the sold listings, although slightly different, very similar, 293 versus 289 last week. So this week we'll most likely see a larger number as we hit the end of the month and into the new month of February. And rates also are remaining about the same. So on Mortgage News Daily's survey, I do highly recommend this survey compared to going on to different websites to see what rates are. Many places where you look for rates, there are promotions and advertisements that are not extremely clear, right? Oh, get a 5.5% rate, but you don't know that you're paying $30,000 for that rate. I'm just giving an example, right? But a place like Mortgage News Daily is surveying some of the top lenders and telling you what their rates actually are. And you're getting to see those numbers, whether it's a 30-year fix, which is what we talk about here, which is the most common, but there's 15 years, VAs, FHA. The whole works is shown on their website. So last week, 7.07 over the last week, and then the previous week, 7.08% for mortgages. So we're still hovering right around the 7% mark. Some people are getting a little bit lower rates, and those would be people putting maybe 20% plus down, have really great credit scores and great income, lower debt to income ratios, things like that. Other people in that same boat are getting a little bit higher for different reasons. Maybe their credit's not as good, or they're putting less down, or it is a little bit higher on that debt to income ratio. So those are just things to consider. The rates here are averages, and everybody's situation's a little bit different, and you don't really know what your rate would be until you go through that whole process. Now, let's take a little bit of a tangent here, and I think it's relevant. I had somebody ask this question. I think it's important to talk about the LA wildfires as far as how it might affect the housing market, right? I think that's a great question. In the last few years, so census data is usually like a whole year behind. So last year's data, or 2023's data, published last year, end of last year, there were about 40,000 people that moved here from LA. There were, or not LA specifically, but California. And there were 212,000 people that moved to the Seattle area. In 2022, those numbers were a little bit larger. 50,000 from California, 250,000 total migrated to Washington, and Texas and Oregon are two of the most common places outside of California, people moving to Washington. So how will the wildfires affect people maybe moving out of California? And I think there are a lot of variables to consider. So, there are things like, hey, my family lives in California. Am I going to move away from my family? A lot of people do, right? They move every year. We just talked about that. My job's in California. My house is in California. Maybe they want to rebuild. But there were a lot of people displaced from their homes. Some burned down, and some lost their living situations, which is really unfortunate. But as we're thinking about how it affects the Seattle real estate market, I think the effect's going to be minimal. I think we already have a lot of people moving here every single year. I think there will be some people that do decide to move to Washington. They won't all move to Seattle, but there will be people that decide to move to Washington. There will be some people that move other places, which happens as well. And there will be quite a few people that decide to stay and rebuild as well. So I think just looking at the migration numbers and seeing how many people are moving here on a regular basis, there will be people, but I don't know if that difference between maybe like last year, 212,000 in the 2023 data versus 250,000 in the 2022 data. I don't know if that really made a huge impact specifically on the home sales, but it does affect the rentals as well. So just again, general thoughts here. LA wildfires will not significantly affect the housing market here in Seattle. There will be more people maybe that move here than normal. And we'll see that. It's going to take a few years until we see those stats, but I don't think it's going to have much of an effect on prices or the competition for housing here in Seattle. We'll wrap up with some quick thoughts for where we're headed. So I mentioned earlier, we are trending up with new listings, which is good. There's really still not enough houses out there on the market. There are some that have been sitting for a while, and some of those will continue to sit for a while. But at this point, there are not enough houses on the market. The competition is real. I just had a house that I was planning to show Saturday that was sold. It was like listed Friday, and we went out. We were scheduled to see it, and the agent texted me and said, hey, sorry, we are sold. It's gone. And that happens when the market's really, really hot, but it doesn't happen as much when the market's cool. And so that's one sign that I had even this week that the market is still really, really tight. And I think as we're heading into the spring, we're going to see more and more listings coming on the market. And if you want a little bit more detail into my thoughts about what's happening here in 2025, take a look at the 2025 market predictions. I made a video about that a few weeks back here in the studio with one of my lender partners, Dan Keller, and he has great thoughts about the mortgage market as well. I think that video would be really valuable to get a grasp for what might happen here in Seattle in 2025. If you have more specific questions about your situation, you can drop them in the comments. I'm happy to answer those or even make it part of one of these videos. And then if you want to chat a little bit more personally, jumping on a phone call or sending an email, I'd be happy to connect with you that way too.